Thank you.
Okay, welcome everybody. Good afternoon to session 63, Individual Papers, Mitigating Risk in a Dangerous World. My name is Vivian Shorty and I'll be chairing today's session. I would like to firstly begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the Wangal and Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to just let everybody know too that we're going to keep Q&A for the end, but there is a chat box both with the Hoover app but also through Zoom, so please feel free as the presenters are presenting to drop any questions you may have. Please also let me know who you wish them to be directed to from all the panelists so I can address them at the end when we have Q&A. We're going to kick off firstly with someone I've had the pleasure to work with before, Matthew Dorfstaetter. So I hope I pronounced that right, Matt. So I'm going to get you to begin your presentation and then we'll follow on from there. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Viv. Getting this screen sharing going and then we can kick off. Can you just let me know when it comes through? I assume you can see my screen, Viv? Perfect. Welcome, everyone. And thanks very much for joining us today. And it's a great privilege for me to kick off this session by discussing the integration of counter-trafficking practices in disaster response and recovery. My name is Matt Dorfstaetter, and I'm working with Freedom in Disasters, which we'll get a bit more information about that as we move throughout the presentation. So what are we talking about today? Today we talk about the Asia Pacific region. We have about 4.2 billion people in this region, and we have a very high rate of human mobility. So our region experiences some of the world's worst natural disasters, such as earthquake, volcanic eruptions, and cyclones and so on. We also have some of the mega cities with a lot of the cities exceeding 8 million people, and therefore we have a great number of people exposed to hazards. And from a human trafficking perspective, that creates an opportunity for traffickers. So in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, traffickers operate and exploit affected people and their desires for safety and means of income. So basically we have people being exploited when they're at most vulnerable, which is just a very horrific trait that currently is reality, always has been in humankind. But this is the topic that we're going to discuss today in the short 15 minutes that I'll be sharing with you. So let's look briefly at what this looks like in reality. We'll hear a story about someone called Maria.
Haitian. After the January earthquake in Haiti, a growing number of young women who lost everything in their homeland began seeking a future here. So many have come in recent months that some young Dominican prostitutes told the Nuevo Herald that their Haitian competitors will soon outnumber them. On these mean streets, hunger made Maria sell her body. She is 12. Maria crossed the border in February with her cousins, who are 13 and 10 years old. A hustler, as human traffickers are called here, helped them cross into the Dominican Republic. She says the price was her virginity.
So this is one of the horrifying examples that are reality in almost every disaster that we have in the developing context. And there is many that are untold, and there is a lot of underreporting going on. So today we're going to explore what role the development sector can play and has to play. So let's briefly recap. What is human trafficking? So the United Nations defines human trafficking as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by improper means, such as force, abduction, or fraud, for an improper purpose. So therefore, we have three elements that need to be present to have human trafficking occurring. which is the acts, the means, and the purpose. And today we have in modern day slavery about 40 million people trapped. 1/4 of them are children, and 3/4 are women and girls. And interestingly, from a private personal perspective, was that almost half of the perpetrators are actually females. So I think the concept that most of us have in our head about how human trafficking does occur is probably slightly skewed. So as a disaster management practitioner, I became quite interested in the topic probably about 5 years ago. But in 2020, I partnered up with a colleague of mine from the International Institute of Applied System Analysis, and we conducted some preliminary research into this topic, and we followed up with stakeholder interviews from the UN and everyone in the field to try to identify what is really going on during such disasters. And we limited our research to natural disasters, such as tsunamis, earthquakes, and fires, and we purposely excluded drought or armed conflicts, as things like Syria do present quite a different context. And as you would acknowledge, they would take quite a different form, as the human trafficking trade is much more integrated into social economic fabric. So today we're focusing purely on fast onset disasters, such as a tsunami that's going to pop up quickly in a region, or an earthquake, or whatever. So what did we find out? Sudden onset disasters typically cause unexpected loss of land and lives, and the destruction of means of livelihoods instantly sort of plunges those without a safety net into poverty. And in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, displacement is likely to occur, which gives then space for traffickers to operate and exploit those affected people. And this leads to one of two things. It either leads to a sharp rise in human trafficking in the region that's already experiencing human trafficking, or it creates a completely new hotspot for human trafficking. And I think some of you might be familiar with the examples that presented itself after the Balkan sex trade in the 1990s, where the UN and military personnel were involved in actively facilitating that sort of trade. So it's not per se a new phenomenon that we have. But getting back to understanding what generates the trafficker's opportunity, we have a couple of causes of vulnerabilities. You have a breakdown of law and order, a breakdown of family structures. You have a gender discrimination that's particularly in terms of access to employment and education. And you have weak systems of accountability. And in generally, we know that those vulnerabilities that exist prior to a disaster do get exacerbated during a disaster. And it's gonna hit specifically those groups who are homeless or displaced, such as people in camps, or people who have to move children, or children who have to look after children, female household heads often. So those are the vulnerable elements. And what happens during a disaster? So from a human trafficking perspective, the pre-existing vulnerabilities grow, and the country's capacity to respond to a crime is generally quite low. As you can imagine, the resources are already depleted. And in the chaos of this crisis, there's often a weakening of the rule in law, which can create conditions that allow traffickers to act with impunity. Human trafficking also is purely understood amid the disaster management and the humanitarian sector, and remains largely unaddressed by governmental and non-governmental actors, even today. So the past decades have seen a global effort towards anti-human trafficking in humanitarian crises, including those of disasters that are triggered by natural disasters. Yet the topic is largely overlooked in our area for a reason that we couldn't really identify, but the Asia Pacific has significant gaps in dealing with that problem. And the demand for sexual services by human actors can lead in itself for international trafficking of women and girls. You see that in almost every disaster, even in our world, like Christchurch, you have a boom of industrial industry work and a lot of workers come in, and therefore organized crimes pick up on the opportunity and smuggle people in, usually for sex work. So it's quite a bad scene that happens. So let's go back quickly to Maria's example.
Since the earthquake, an average of 1,000 Haitian children like Maria and her cousins leave the country illegally each month in the hands of traffickers. This joint investigation by a Nuevo Herald and the Miami Herald uncovered an appalling trauma that is blatantly ignored by authorities in both countries. Most children are smuggled in the northern region of the island, where the Masacre River marks the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic.
So as you can see from the short clip, in reality does present a number of obstacles to combat that illicit trade. And in the Haiti example, it was specific horrific. We had UNICEF estimated that the numbers were between 25 and 100 children a day. So that's just, yeah, much more than, yeah, one child obviously is too much, but 25 to 100 a day is quite a different dimension. So what can we do? There is no silver bullet, but as a first step, we have to acknowledge that we combat a systemic issue. So you have to have a systems approach to address it. You need to understand that by doing one action, it just doesn't lead to another action, as I think everyone who works in development would clearly understand. And just to briefly outline what it could look like, you need to understand the different actors, how fast onset hazards interact with spatial units, with social structures, with the actors, with the international community, how they come in. And then you would need to analyze how each of those actors fall into the prevention, protection, prosecution cycle, which are the three areas of how human trafficking can be combated. And then you identify combined programs that would work for multiple aspects to combat human trafficking on many levels, and you have to analyze the interdependencies. So I didn't mean to present a comprehensive approach obviously today, but just to give an overview that this is a complex problem that definitely requires a system of systems approach to combat it. As a second, we have to lay the foundation for transformation. And when I say we, I'm talking about the humanitarian sector, I'm talking about the development sector, and I'm talking about the law enforcement sector. Those three sectors do often, if you can call them sectors, if they do often operate in silos, and as you probably understand from other contexts, are hardly interrelated. So we identified 7 key steps of what can be done, and they were backed up partly by research, but as I mentioned before, there's hardly any research that has been done into that topic. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that was taken to come up with the 7 key steps. Number 1, so as humanitarian development and law enforcement sector, we have to come together and embrace the challenge ahead. This allows us to build networks that can be activated during a disaster and develop counter-human trafficking strategies that commence at least when a disaster strikes, but ideally are done in peace times and tested previously. Step number 2, inform, educate, and raise awareness. One of the reasons of why I'm talking to you today. Ideally before, but at least immediately following the initial disaster impact. As we learned, we know that human trafficking in disaster builds on pre-existing vulnerabilities. Therefore, programming needs to approach vulnerable communities and individuals and educates them about human trafficking risk and specific trends in the region. When we did the preliminary research, we also discovered some fantastic examples of how that trade can be stopped if the right actors, local actors, are empowered early enough, and kids are kept in schools, economic income is opportunities are presented to them, and so on. Third, the evidence based on the literature addressing the counter-human trafficking intersection is extremely poor. So we do need more research to understand the dynamics in its space, and in particular how international organized crime utilizes such opportunities to their advantage. This topic is relatively new, and therefore much more needs to be done to understand the complexities. Fourth is definitions really do matter. We stumbled across a number of case studies where the lack of definition of human trafficking did cause to confusion between law enforcement and humanitarian actors, and therefore the protective actions they wanted to take were weak at the best. Number 5, effort should be made to understand vulnerabilities, both from the disaster management and humanitarian trafficking perspective. There's a lot of shared vulnerabilities that can be addressed easily. For example, when you have an earthquake hit an area, you need to establish economic stimulus for the region. The same economic stimulus prevents victims from falling into traps to seek jobs in other regions. The same goes with schools. The same goes with general education, health systems. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities that are shared between human trafficking and disaster management. And by making each sector aware of each other and how the combined interest can create better benefit, we would create a better outcome. Number 6, when it comes to accepting the need for transformation, it's important that we have a sober view of what mechanisms are currently in place. And as previously discussed, we have a siloed approach between the law enforcement and the other sectors, which does not lead to really good collaborative outcomes. And as you can understand, when a disaster strikes, almost all the governance mechanisms fall apart and people revert back to what they're used to. So if they know the people and have established good networks, good personal relationships, they will keep working together. If not, there's probably not much hope. And 7, lastly, most importantly, we have to hand over power. I think that's a general topic with development. It's a general understanding. It's nothing new. As international actors, when we come into a disaster zone or when we come into a development area, we sometimes do like to pretend that we know things better or that we know things. Clearly, we know a lot. We have a lot of subject matter expertise. We can bring a lot of case studies to the local area, but we then have to really hand that knowledge over and hand the decision-making into the power of local actors, those actors who understand the cultural context, understand the social fabric, and understand the economic needs that region has. So those are the 7 key steps that we came up with of how they're done, of how we could approach the topic. And then lastly, we need to give the issue attention that it deserves. And for that purpose, late last year, earlier this year, we started to create an organization called Freedom in Disaster, which is, to our knowledge, the only international body that focuses on combating human trafficking in disasters. It's currently not just overlooked in policy, it's also overlooked in programming, and it's overlooked in law enforcement. It's a sort of area that's really gray and quite new in disaster management, so it really deserves attention. So we partnered up with organizations, with academia. We're doing advocacy work, training, design standards, and work on those 7 key steps, building one little block at a time. And I would just like to close the session off with one question or aspiration for the audience. You're probably aware of that, but in the Japanese alphabet, in kanji, the word crisis is made up of 2 symbols. One is danger and one is opportunity. So clearly out of that culture comes the notion that every disaster, every crisis presents an amazing opportunity as well. So what if we start to think that disasters can actually be the catalyst for alleviating existing vulnerabilities rather than exacerbating them? And if that's the case, can a disaster therefore be utilized to eradicate or at least reduce human trafficking, not exacerbate it as it's currently the case? And I think this is a vision that's worth sharing with the development sector. And I really hope that I raised a little bit of awareness of the topic, and would now like to hand back to Viv, and can't wait to hear about the other presentation in this session. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's shocking statistics, as you say, and I would encourage everybody to follow Freedom in Disasters on LinkedIn and follow the work that they do and see what Matt and his team are working on, because it is an area that needs a lot more awareness. So thank you for that, and thank you for sharing, Matt. Our next speaker is Kearrin Sims from James Cook University, and he'll be discussing navigating risk when thinking and working politically, the work and disappearance of Sombath Somphone. Thank you so much, Kearrin, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Viv. I'm presenting today from Jabberkai country on the land of the Irukandji people, and I just begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners and their elders past, present and emerging. On December 15, 2012, Sombath Somphone, an internationally esteemed community development worker, was abducted at a police checkpoint in Vientiane, the capital of Laos. In more precise terms, Sombath was the victim of an enforced disappearance, which is defined as when a person is abducted by or with the acquiescence of the state and there is a refusal to acknowledge the person's whereabouts. Today, I'll discuss a number of possibilities as to why Sombath was abducted, and then consider if his abduction offers us any insights for thinking and working politically. One key point that I seek to make today is that further consideration must be given to how the dangers of politically oriented development may be anticipated and mitigated. I will use Sombath's case as a means to draw attention to 4 risks that need to be navigated when thinking and working politically. So just a quick summary of thinking and working politically for those of you who may not be overly familiar with this approach. In an attempt to break away from technocratic and political development interventions, which seek to render technical, complex social and political challenges, proponents of TWP argue that development aid should have explicitly political goals. Accordingly, TWP calls for development workers to intentionally and openly think and act politically in order to achieve more effective development programming. So just to be clear, TWP is not limited to projects with solely political aims. Rather, it can and has been applied across a range of interventions, including, for example, things like social cash transfers, supporting peace processes, addressing pre-trial detention, climate change mitigation, and even industrial policy reform. So advocates of TWP sit along a continuum, ranging from those who support the adoption of politically savvy methods for improving development outcomes, to those who advocate for international development organisations to contribute to democratisation and the enhancement of political freedoms. In an influential book by Carruthers and de Gramont, they outline 5 key attributes as being core to TWP thinking. I won't read through these today, but if anyone's interested, we can always refer back to them in the question time if that's needed. So, brief summary of TWP. I'd like to turn now to Sombath Somphone and his work. Sombath was born in 1952 in a small rural village in the south of Laos. His parents were materially impoverished subsistence farmers, and this gave him first-hand insights into the challenges and the hardships of Lao peasant life. Sombath's parents knew the value of education, and they encouraged him to study hard. As a teenager and a young man, he gained scholarships to study in the US, where he even started a PhD. And this international experience gave him new perspectives on development and rural life in Laos. In 1996, Sombath established Laos' first Indigenous non-profit association, the Participatory Development Training Centre, or PADEC. So commencing with a team of 5 founding members, PADEC grew to 50 employees and over 2,000 young volunteers. PADEC's work is based on the principles of education for sustainable development, and it received commendations and awards both nationally and internationally. So Sombath's long and illustrious career demonstrates the value of thinking and working politically, and includes projects across diverse sectors which successfully enhanced people's livelihoods and their aspirations through programming focused on strengthening community needs, leadership, learning and assets. I haven't got time to offer examples of all the projects that he was involved in today, but what I've included on the slide is a link to an article that does discuss this at more length. What I do want to emphasise for today is that Sombath's work demonstrated a deep understanding of the political realities of the context that he worked in, and persistent efforts to engage with a diversity of relevant stakeholders inside and outside of government in order to work strategically as a facilitating element in local processes of change. He acknowledged that development is a political process, and his work focused on feasible rather than best practice solutions. Laos is not an easy place to do effective development work, and Sombath was someone who, using TWP-style programming, was able to do this. For this reason, studying his work offers many useful examples of TWP principles in practice. And yet, despite decades of successfully pursuing politically astute approaches to development, Sombath could not entirely avoid the dangers of pushing for change in a heavily oppressive and authoritarian state. So while his work demonstrates the merits of TWP, his disappearance also presents some difficult questions. Why, after so many years of successful state partnerships, including numerous awards, was he suddenly recategorised as a dissident? And why was he abducted? And if development is inherently political, how can the risks of development work in oppressive states be more effectively anticipated and mitigated? Similarly, where are the boundaries between safe and unsafe thinking and working politically work? To consider these questions, I'll now turn to his disappearance. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, in 2012, Sombath was abducted at a police checkpoint in the Lao capital of Vientiane. His abduction was recorded on CCTV, and if you would like to see it, you can watch this footage on YouTube as part of an hour-long award-winning documentary on his work and disappearance. Laos is a single-party state governed by an authoritarian regime that has ruled for more than 40 years without opposition. It's one of the most politically oppressive societies, and the party state has very little tolerance for public criticism. So enforced disappearances are one of a number of methods that the state uses to suppress public debate. And three prominent examples of this are that of Somphone Kantisuk, who was abducted in January 2007 by 4 men wearing police uniforms, Od Sayavong's disappearance in 2019 following his protests outside of the Lao embassy in Bangkok, and of course Sombath Somphone's disappearance. What makes the disappearance of Sombath particularly significant, however, is that he always sought to work with rather than in opposition to the state. The defining reason for Sombath's disappearance may never be confirmed, but many believe it resulted from his co-convening of the 2012 9th Asia-Europe People's Forum, or the AEPF for short. The AEPF was the first international civil society event ever held in Laos. It accompanied the Asia-Europe meeting and was attended by delegates from more than 40 countries. In the lead up to the AEPF, there was much excitement that a new phase of enhanced political freedom was emerging. Unfortunately, this enthusiasm was crushed as the forum unfolded. According to a confidential report documented by attending organisations, Lao participants were photographed and threatened by members of the audience that were believed to be party representatives. At least one participant who spoke about land concessions and displacements also received intimidating visits from the police following her presentation. As co-convener of the forum, Sombath may have been viewed as orchestrating an event that embarrassed the Lao People's Revolutionary Party and which threatened elite capture. So in the following slides, I'll run through 4 key factors that may have led to or contributed to his disappearance, and then reflect on potential implications of these factors for thinking and working politically. The AEPF was the largest civil society event ever held in Laos, with approximately 1,000 people attending. Accordingly, it brought international attention to human rights abuses and political oppression. From a TWP perspective, the forum could be understood as a sudden opportunity for change. And indeed, this is how it was perceived by Sombath and many other progressive actors from within and from outside of Laos. From the perspective of the members of the party state, however, raising politically sensitive issues in the spotlight of the international community was reportedly seen as an act of national betrayal. These views were reinforced, it's also believed, by rumours that Sombath was becoming a national icon for freedom within Laos. So during a planning meeting for the AEPF, consideration was given to inviting the Burmese political activist Aung San Suu Kyi as a keynote speaker. As chair of the meeting and as co-convener of the forum, Sombath presented this idea to relevant members of the Lao government, who strongly rejected it. While no further attempts were made to engage Aung San Suu Kyi, sometime after his abduction, a senior member of the government confidentially informed his wife that there had been concern about him becoming an Aung San Suu Kyi-like figure. So a second key potential factor here in his disappearance overlaps with the political and international significance of the event, and that is timing. So while Aung San Suu Kyi has since faced considerable criticism, in 2012, she was an internationally praised figure of political resistance and freedom. In April 2012, her party, the National League for Democracy, won a landslide victory in Myanmar's by-election, and in June, she met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, wearing a scarf produced by Sauban, a small Lao enterprise that is supported by PADEC. In addition to the AEPF's internationally significant timing, 2012 marked a time of political optimism within Laos. Indeed, the announcement of Laos holding the AEPF added to widespread feelings that political freedoms were expanding. Sombath also felt this, and it was partly for this reason that he agreed to co-chair the AEPF as a final contribution to leadership before retiring. Unfortunately, times of greatest opportunity for political change are also frequently times of heightened risk and violent backlash. A third insight, or perhaps just reminder, arising from Sombath's disappearance is that even in authoritarian contexts, the state is not a homogeneously oppressive body. According to Sombath's wife, one determining factor in his disappearance was a disconnect between those in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs tasked with hosting the AEPF and representatives of the party state public security establishment. For the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the AEPF represented an image-enhancing opportunity to improve the international perception of Laos and its increasing political freedoms. By contrast, representatives of the party security forces sought to harass and intimidate those who had attended the event. So in other words, internal tensions within the party state and condemnation from particular party elites placed participating participants at risk of persecution. Finally, Sombath's disappearance also highlights the need for TWP approaches to examine different strategies of oppression within authoritarian contexts. Enforced disappearances have been a recurrent feature of political oppression in Laos, arguably representing a routine mode of governance that is periodically deployed to maintain a pervasive state of fear. All of the key informants from my research identify the AEPF as a key contributing factor in Sombath's disappearance. They also suggest, however, that his actions in organising and convening the forum continued to reflect his commitment to working productively with government. As I've noted, many members of government were also supportive of the event. As such, informants argue that while the AEPF marked a culminating event, Sombath's disappearance was a consequence of a party state strategy of oppression to target a leading domestic development worker. As one informant states, he was not targeted because he suddenly became too critical. He was targeted because he was so trusted by everyone that his disappearance would send a very strong message. Sombath's disappearance was not about silencing him. It was about silencing the whole country. Sombath's disappearance then suggests 4 factors that are pertinent to TWP programming, particularly within authoritarian contexts. When these factors are drawn together, TWP can quickly create high-risk environments for development workers. So the factors I've discussed are international exposure, timing, particular elites, and strategies of oppression. Closing just with some brief final further suggestions. Sombath's disappearance shows the need for the international community to support domestic actors and organisations that seek to work for political change. If INGOs are silent on enforced disappearances and other forms of harm, they may be complicit in bolstering authoritarian regimes. However, if INGOs voice dissent too boldly or in ways that are deemed too antagonistic, they may also heighten the level of risk for domestic actors. This means there's a need for careful nuance in what forms of support are provided. TWP programming then would benefit from some further consideration of how the dangers of politically oriented development work may be anticipated and mitigated, how the risks of TWP are unevenly distributed between local and international development actors, and the associated need for differential yet supportive approaches to TWP between these two cohorts. So TWP has much to offer, but it must include careful attention to risk prevention and mitigation, as well as the differential positionality and risk factors of local and international development organisations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kearrin. Yeah, it's a pretty chilling picture you painted there, and certainly something that needs a lot of nuance and attention paid to it. So thank you for sharing, obviously, your research on what you're doing in this area. I'm going to pass it over now to two Australia Award scholars, Ammar and Maya, and they are going to be discussing creating women-friendly cities in Southeast Asia and the Pacific for critical discourse analysis. Thank you, Maya and Ammar.
Sure. All right. Thank you, Vivian, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our session today. My name is Maya, and I'm here with my colleague Ammar to talk about women-friendly cities in the Pacific, a critical discourse analysis. But before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we present today and pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So our presentation today will be divided into two parts. First, I will provide the overview of our research and also the theoretical background, while Ammar will explain the analysis of our case study. So to start with, we set our analysis with the notion that cities are a gendered space in which women's experiences and needs are often ignored. In particular, we focus on one pervasive experience, that is violence against women and girls in urban spaces and how it hinders women's right to the city. Concerning this issue, feminist activism has called for the creation of more gender-just cities. A good example of such effort is the launching of UN program in 2010 called Safe Cities and Safe Public Space Global Program, or SCGP, which aims to eliminate violence against women and girls in public spaces. This program so far has been implemented in more than 30 cities across the world. A little bit of background, the SCGP initiative is included as recommended actions to address structural and underlying causes, also risk factors to prevent violence against women and girls. This initiative also aligns with other UN-led global programs like 2030 SDGs Agenda and the New Urban Agenda in 2016. The initiative was first implemented in 5 cities, but our research focused in Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. The reason why Port Moresby is included in the program is because in 2013, Port Moresby is ranked as one of the 5 least livable cities due to the high level of violence, especially violence against women and girls. The SCGP initiative in Port Moresby is framed around 2 sectors, market and public transport. Ammar will later explain the initiative in more detail. But I would like to point out here is the reason why market and public transport are chosen as the focus of the program. As can be seen from these 2 quotes here, market is chosen because it is the space where women earn their income, which makes it a strategic entry point to ensure women's and girls' safety. On the other hand, the public transport initiative is implemented to support the market initiative, since a safe bus can ensure women's economic participation in cities. While this initiative seems to be a positive effort to create a women-friendly city, we are interested to critically examine the logic behind such initiative, especially why global institutions like UN keeps promoting the project as a recommended action to eliminate violence against women and girls. And to give a brief overview of our research focus and methodology, our research can be understood as a form of analytical resistance because we examine and problematize the underlying ideology behind an initiative. Here, we argue that SCGP initiatives are an extension of urban neoliberalism, where the primary objective is not to eliminate violence against women and girls, but to increase economic growth. Through a critical reading of the notion of right to the gendered city, which I will explain in a minute, along with a feminist critical discourse analysis of UN documents, we demonstrate that the initiative does not disrupt patriarchal social order. And we also reveal that such initiative manifests an urban neoliberal project. For the methodology, we conduct a feminist critical discourse analysis by focusing on these 5 documents. And other than that, we also deeply engage with existing literature on gender and urban spaces, particularly right to the gendered city and urban neoliberalism. So let's now move on to the theoretical background. First, we use the concept of right to the city, which was first introduced by Henry Louvev. This concept is very influential within urban scholarship, where many scholars and practitioners have tried to interpret and unpack the concept. Here we incorporate interpretations by urban scholars, such as de Souza, who defines, and I'm quoting him here, right to the city as the right to a very different life in the context of a very different just society. Also Harvey, who defines right to the city as a collective right rather than an individual right. Also Purcell, who emphasizes on the right to use public space and the right to participation. However, many urban scholars also have argued that the idea of right to the city has often been trivialized. In addition to that, feminist scholars like Fenster has criticized Louvev's concept because it does not give a substantial attention to patriarchal power relations which abuse women's right to the city. Feminist scholars also emphasize the impact of public-private divide within the concept, because according to them, right to the gendered city should start at the most private space, that is home. And another scholar like Englund also emphasized the importance of intersectionality in creating a future gender just cities. And another concept that we use is urban neoliberalism. Urban scholars have identified a shift towards a new urban politics that is dubbed as entrepreneurial cities, in which cities are regarded as a site for capital accumulation, growth machines, and profitable entities. In this vein, interurban cities competition have promoted neoliberal policy regimes, which encourage market-based solutions to solve urban problems. However, it is also important to understand that neoliberalism is not only a set of economic policies or economic system, but it is also a dominant political rationality. Rothenberg has suggested that neoliberalism is a form of governmentality which produces subjects, behavior, and organizations of the society. In the case of urban politics, neoliberalism normatively constructs individuals as entrepreneurial actors, where all individuals are expected to be self-sufficient in order to secure their livelihood. As a result, there is a rise of an informal economy where women's role is particularly high in that sector. So in short, under neoliberal rationality, entrepreneurial cities have converted women into generic human capital while dismissing their gender identity. And by incorporating those concepts together, let us now turn to our case study, of which Ammar will explain the analysis of the SC program and its implementation in Port Moresby. Ammar, over to you.
Thank you, Maya. Now, I'd like to provide you all with our analysis of the UN documents that become our samples, particularly in Port Moresby, and I'll show you some texts which are our data, then I will present our analysis. And in this paragraph, which I quote from Lakshmi, suffices to demonstrate the way in which the initiative has not meaningfully incorporated the idea of the right to the city. First, for example, the right to the city is framed as an individual right in the sentence, like it encompasses every person's rights to mobility and access. It is problematic because it is understood as a new right that should be added into the existing liberal human rights framework that needs to be guaranteed by the states. Moreover, the language of access in this initiative is presented in ways that are linked to market access. Like, for example, it is only those women who have money, who are able to afford watching cultural festivals or going to the cinemas, who can enjoy the cultural opportunities that cities offer. And the second, as the text shows, the initiative aims to enable the right of women and girls to use public spaces. Yet at the same time, in the other text, the initiative as well reinforces the public-private divide. It assumes that violence against women and girls in public spaces and private spaces are two different phenomena. And that's why, consequently, such a dichotomy hinders the full realization of women's rights to the gendered city, as right to the gendered city is supposed to be started at home. And the primacy of public spaces over private spaces reinforces patriarchal power relation by which home is the primary site of inequality for women. And the third, we show that the initiative pays special attentions to gender sensitive and gender inclusive planning, which speaks to right to participation of women in this context in urban decision making. However, we see that it is clear women's participation is only understood as a mere strategy of the objective to achieve the goal of the initiative itself, and instead of the objective itself. And moving on to the next slide, it raises the question of what is actually the objective of this initiative. We contend that the main objective of this initiative is actually grounded on the growth logic of development and modernization that is closely tied to urban neoliberal projects, aiming to privatize and marketize women's safety as a solution to violence against women and girls. We quote three statements coming from Safe Cities global leaders at a forum in 2015 to demonstrate our contention. So the first text, demonstrates that violence against women and girls seen as an economic problem, which hinders the full potential of economic growth, rather than seen as gender and social injustices. The discourse of making cities safe for women and girls to eliminate violence against women and girls conceals the market logic behind the initiative. And then the other two texts illuminate the way in which the language of women's economic empowerment has become a dominant narrative in the initiative that speaks to its actual objective of making cities safe for women. Safe cities will provide women a space in the modern structures that is critical for economic growth, while at the same time, it reproduces gender inequality through the existing gender division of labor, as women are continuously overrepresented in informal sector. That will be discussed later on in our case study. Our contention in general also aligns with critical scholars who have made compelling arguments as to how post-2015 global development frameworks are premised on states of growth logic that sustain through a market metrics. Now, we use Port Moresby Safe Cities program to illustrate the way in which this initiative reflects on an urban neoliberal agenda. I'll show you these two pictures that represent the condition of Gordon markets before and after redevelopment. This $12 million project, partially funded by New Zealand government and National Capital District Commission, is deemed as a standout project for the capital city. And while it sounds very empowering because it is aimed to empower women economically, it is rather problematic because its urban design solution to eliminate violence against women and girls ignores the wider social causation, which is rooted in a patriarchal social order. What it is envisioned in this initiative is an entrepreneurial city of which markets, as part of urban space, need to be redeveloped to realize its potential as a site for capital accumulation. However, only recently, women vendors in Gordon Market have complained about the rise of costs for installing the stall to sell their produce. If this is not being accommodated, this potentially results in the establishment of other informal markets outside the Gordon Market and hence reproducing inequality even more. Additionally, this text shows the initiative has also incorporated other poverty reduction strategies through microfinance scheme. They have MyCash wallet implemented in Garehu since 2013. However, the program has been stopped in 2015 because it fails to actually address the problem. And then it echoes the finding from many critical development scholars who have shown how microcredit scheme has been very ineffective strategy to address poverty. And lastly, in this text, without the market, I would have no way feeding my children. which was, and I quote from Sarah Thomas, the president of the Gordon Market Mini Goods Vendor Association. We show how neoliberalism as a political rationality has successfully converted women as generic human capital and shaped the way in which women see their affective aspect of life, feeding their children, through a market lens, as if there is no other way but market calculation. Now, complementing the previous initiative, Port Moresby Safe Cities Program also carries out safe public transport initiative called Mary Safe Bus. And as we can see again in this text, the provision of women-only buses has been used to advance women's economic participation rather than to protect them from violence against women. Although we have also heard that it's been very ineffective to segregate women and men in public transport as a tool to address violence against women. Yet at the same time, the initiative also normalizes women's triple roles. In this text, you can see that the initiative reinforces the women have triple roles: productive, reproductive, and community managing roles, which we see as intensifying gender division of labor. And then last but not least, from these two texts, I think this really represent how Safe Public Transport Initiative is actually an urban neoliberal project, because the main goal of this project is about commercializing public transport and then expanding this as a business and make safety as services that should be provided and commercialized to actually address violence against women. And to conclude, we have demonstrated that the elimination of violence against women and girls is actually far away from the objective of the Safe Cities program. The program is rather premised on a growth logic of development that is closely tied to urban neoliberalism. Think about this picture. When women in Port Moresby rallied for justice, taking down the streets from Parliament Building to Sir John Guy Stadium last year, demanding for justice after the death of a young mother of two due to violence against her. This rally actually asks us about what does it take to make cities safe and women-friendly.
And another question that we need to think is whether the initiative suffices to achieve what we deem as women-friendly cities, or do we need something more than just changes in urban design? So this is a cry for justice to end violence against women and girls, a process of dismantling public-private dichotomy and enabling women's participation in the search of alternative urban politics. We can think of disrupting the existing gender division of labor or redistributing social reproductive roles, valuing unpaid care work, or the provision of economic and social protection for women, instead of offering privatized or marketized urban solutions. This is critical to fully realize women's right to the gendered city. So I guess I'll just throw the questions to the public. So what do you think? And that's the end of our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ammar and Maya. That was really interesting and looks like a lot of work has gone into your research there. We've got some time for questions. I will actually just quickly hand it back to both of you, Maya and Ammar. Someone has said in the chat, great presentation. How can we practice so-called Western idea of development and local voices / traditions? What are your thoughts on that?
Right. I think it's very interesting because when we talk about this initiative itself, it has always been glorified that we should make locally owned solution. But again, we can see that the way in which the global North solution is very evident in this context to address violence against women and girls in Port Moresby by, say, redeveloping the markets. And we can see that those constructions company coming from New Zealand, and then also those buses coming from Australia, and actually looking at the way in which this development should be seen as a modernization, as a process of getting more money, and it divert the actual problem on the ground, which is the violence against women and girls that is rooted from the patriarchal social order. So I think in negotiating these two aspects, global North, global South solution is really deemed necessary. And instead of just, see the problem as global South problem, the global North has to help to address it, I think we should fully embrace the local ideas of what it is to actually address the problem. I think, yeah. What do you think, Maya?
Well, I guess Ammar has summarized it very well, but I think I got a reflection from the previous speakers, like throughout this conference from yesterday and today, like everyone has been speaking in the context of COVID-19. Actually, a lot of development practitioners who are deemed as the experts from the global North, when COVID-19 happened, they left the country and they left the locals, or like they said it, locals to, like practice it by themselves. I think that's also like, we need to reflect, like, how can we really incorporate these local experts, like the one who actually know what's going on there, like instead of like just imposing, like, you have to fulfill these requirements, you have to fulfill these standards, this quality, and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I guess it's still a long process to go, but I'm optimistic about that.
You are muted.
I was on mute. Thank you so much for your answers. It is really interesting. And just as a side note, the XYX lab at Monash University are also doing really interesting things with safe spaces. Even in Melbourne, focused there with Plan International and making cities safe for women. So it is a global problem that requires global attention and different ways for each community to address it. I can see both Kearrin and Matt, you have responded to some really heavy questions in the chat bar, but I will just maybe put some of these to you more broadly. So Matt, question from Caroline about your reflections on what does or doesn't work with NGOs and police working beside each other. And I'd also add to that, the military as well. When you do have, military coming in, particularly in post-disaster zones, what are your reflections on that? And could you share that with the attendees?
The problem probably, if you go from a scientific perspective, from a research perspective, there isn't enough case studies out there that are documented well enough to identify any trend. What anecdotally, though, it's really depending on the people that are on ground. As I mentioned to the in the chat, it's really if local actors can inform on human trafficking and they work with law enforcement, it works very well, particularly because NGOs typically have the manpower and they are on site. They can identify trends quickly. This is also where we see the biggest progress to be made. If we get the international disaster response community trained to a basic level to just pick up on the main signals of human trafficking and give them a channel to report it, you probably can avoid a lot of that. So I think that's the biggest opportunity.
Great, thank you. And Kearrin, there was a question here that I thought was also really interesting and quite sort of broad from somebody who's anonymous. But have you noticed any trends in TWP or other enforced disappearances that you'd like to reflect on? And could you share a bit of that with the group?
Thanks, Viv, and thanks to the person that asked the question. The question made me think that I should point out, I think that I'm very enthusiastic about thinking and working politically. That's why my interest is in doing the research around this approach. I think development is inherently political. So there's a lot of ongoing work in that space. Within Southeast Asia, the Asia Foundation has been doing some work around TWP. Australian aid programs also been linked to some of these TWP approaches with some of their partners as well, doing some really interesting work as well. So there's lots happening in this space, and there's lots of sort of new contributions being made along the way. The part that I'm particularly interested in is how TWP can be used to try and advance political freedom. So I mentioned in the presentation that TWP can be used just to work in a politically savvy way, or it can be used as a means to try and encourage political freedoms. And I think international development organisations need to do that, but I recognise how incredibly difficult it is for them to do that. And so that's, I guess, the trend I'd like to follow. How can we actually, how can they contribute to political freedoms in a meaningful way that doesn't put their local partners at risk?
Thanks, Kearrin. Look, we've got time for one more question, and this is also directed to you, Kearrin, from Richard Moore. He said, I imagine part of the theory of having the Asia-Europe Civil Society meeting in Laos would help open the space for local actors. Seems that was quite wrong. At a macro level, what do you think are the best strategies are for countries to hold themselves and others accountable for human rights violations?
Yeah, so I mean, it does seem that it was a mistake. The ASEAN People's Forums continue though, and they're an important similar kind of event. And you know, we will never know for certain whether the event could have unfolded in a different way or if this was a somewhat of an inevitable outcome. So the best strategies for countries to hold themselves and others accountability for human rights. Difficult questions, I think, not one that I can probably answer quickly. I think that the very brief answer is to say that lots of different approaches are needed simultaneously. We need the work of lots of different actors involved in lots of different ways. And I know that doesn't answer the question, but I don't think I can do it justice. It's a very important question in the time we have. Thanks, Kearrin. Look, we are out of time. I encourage all of you to obviously join the final plenary. And before we wrap up the conference, the last 2 days, I hope everybody's enjoyed it. Big thank you to our panelists, Matt, Kearrin, Maya, and Ammar today for sharing your research and your expertise. It's been illuminating, chilling, but really important information that needs to be shared, and finding that nuance, I think, really is key. So thanks all of you. And I look forward to seeing you around in the next session, but also seeing you around the sector. Thank you, everybody, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Viv. Thanks all.
Thanks, guys.
Nice
Bye.
to all. Bye.